Alright, so for today's Fundamentals Friday, we won't be discussing the usual design theory, but we'll be focusing on painting, because painting is the thing that I started out doing mostly, and something that I thoroughly enjoyed researching and practicing was edge control. So I'll be discussing some of the things that I like to keep in mind on how to create nice and appealing paintings, and how I go about studying edge control as well. So make sure to keep watching if that interests you, and I hope you guys enjoy. So edge control, I think, is a very interesting subject because edges can be very useful to create a specific sense of appeal in a specific type of painting. So the important question to ask is, why do we use a specific kind of edge? And to make it easy for you guys, I've already kind of grouped things into the 5 categories of edges that I like to think of. So we have our hard edges, our firm edges, our soft edges, our lost edges, and our texture. And each of these serve a different role for the end result for the painting. And the different choices that we can make, or the different reasons to use edges, are going to be A, our readability of our silhouette, B, our readability of our form, and then we have C, the artistic choices. Now you can immediately see which edge, which type of edge would belong to which category or to which reason for us to use the edge. And the hard edges or the sharp edges are the clearest example, I think, of that. Because if you look at the drawings that we have over here, this drawing was made with only the hard edges of this painting. And even though obviously we're missing a lot of information, it is still very identifiable as that skull that we've painted. So there's no mistake there that the edges, the hard edges, serve such an important role for the readability of the silhouette, and that is because the hard edges serve as a containment of our shape. So it's basically building a fence around the shape so that we can see the outline of a specific shape. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to have like that hard edge everywhere on the silhouette, and we'll get into why that is a little bit later down the line. But first, let's move on to the second type of readability, which is going to be the readability of the form, and that's where the firm and the soft edges kind of come into play. Because those firm and soft edges, the purpose of them is not to accentuate the silhouette. Obviously, we're not going to try to get two-dimensional shapes to read with soft and firm edges. What we are going to do is we're going to try to use them to emphasize the transitions within a shape. So, for example, I have my forehead kind of flowing into the side of my head, and that soft transition there is what describes to me that that is a round form. And how long it takes for it to go from one value to another value, like the distance between that transition, is also what helps us identify how sharply that form is turning away. So for example, the skull is very round, so that means from the start where it starts getting darker to the end when we reach our next value, basically it's quite an amount of distance, while down here on the cheekbone you can see, since that's a very sort of narrow part of the design, part of the skull itself, that transition is much shorter, therefore indicating the proper form of this specific painting. So we had containment as a function for the hard edges. The soft and the firm edges serve to just kind of describe the form. So form description is, I think, the main purpose of our firm and soft edges. Now, aside from the firm and the soft edges, we have a few more edge types that we can use. We have the lost edges and the texture. And the lost edges, I think, is where a lot of people get confused. Okay, why do I use a lost edge? How do I know which edges I can afford to keep and which edges I can afford to lose? And I think the reason for that is kind of quite simple. We want to balance our hard edges and our lost edges in particular quite neatly, because our lost edges serve the purpose of making the image a bit more of an artistic impression of a subject rather than a photocopy. So for example, to make this entire skull readable for the silhouette, I need X amount of lines to make sure that I have enough information to understand where the actual skull is situated. So that's mostly the sharp edges doing all of the heavy lifting there. And because I have those sharp edges in quite a few areas already, I can get away with kind of leaving them out in other areas altogether. So for example, if I now just kind of turn off the entire painting, you can see that even though I haven't even finished doing all the hard edges, these are the essential hard edges to at least start understanding what subject it is that I'm trying to convey. And you can see how if I would get rid of some of these, like for example, maybe these ones, I would start losing that message. So there's a very tight line between losing too many edges so that we maybe lose the essence of the image and trying to overstate everything. So the hard edges, again, containment and showing off the silhouette. The lost edges are then the artistic choices, the gates in the fence that I mentioned earlier that we can open up. And this allows the eye to kind of flow through our painting a bit more organically, which makes it hopefully a bit more appealing to look at. It also reduces the importance of certain edges. So for example, the fact that the teeth are sort of going backwards into the darkness, that's maybe not as important to the overall image as perhaps like the edge of the forehead. So I want to put less importance on this, so the edge is getting lost. Texture works in a similar way as being an artistic choice, because the texture is just kind of there to make sure that we're understanding what we're looking at, as like we're still creating a 2D image, but we do need to understand the material of the thing that we're painting as well. But these are the edge types that I personally like to categorize this in. So we want to make sure that our sharp edges and our hard edges serve for the readability of the silhouette, our firm and soft edges serve for the readability of the form, and then we have our lost edges for a little bit of artistic impression. So here's an example of a kind of study that I tend to like to do when it comes to practicing edge control specifically. Statues are a great subject to practice on because they're essentially a value study of a portrait, right? Usually they have a lot of dramatic lighting as well, very clear, identifiable 3D form, which makes it a perfect subject matter for these kind of edge control studies. So what I'll do is I'll divide it up into different steps. And the first step is to identify the large abstract groups of shadow and light. So that means I'm mainly going to focus on those abstract shapes. I'm going to keep them hard edged as long as I can. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm using the shape alone to identify the 3D form. And that really helps me to set up things so that when I actually start adding in those edges, those soft edges, it's going to be much, much easier. So you can take it step by step, going from the initial 2 values to the in-between values, and work your way up in complexity. And the reason I would encourage you guys to start as simple as I did with just kind of 2 shapes of light, just one shape of light and one shape of dark, is it will help prevent you from getting overwhelmed, plus it forces you to dissect a subject into its most simple, bare bones elements, which is in this case that very clear shadow shape on the side of the head, and then the rest of the mid-tone. The only thing I didn't add in the flat stage, let's call it, right now is going to be the highlights, but that's something I'll add in once I actually get to the soft and firm edges. So this is a good point where I would usually transition this painting into actually adding in those soft edges. So you'll see me at some point grab my smudge brush, and I'll just go through and start smudging the form shadows, specifically like all those soft form describing shadows, to really help emphasize that more three-dimensional nature of the statue itself. And you can see that I'm still, when I'm putting my shapes down, I'm still keeping them sharp, but then afterwards just kind of softening an edge to, once again, wrap around the form accurately. And doing it step by step like this is really, really a useful way to approach this, because you'll help just slow down your process, being a bit more methodical, and it'll help you focus on one subject at a time. Again, students tend to get overwhelmed fairly quickly with the amount of information, so reducing that amount of information, I think, is a key thing in keeping the motivation up when you're practicing and doing these kind of studies on your own. The final step would be, and this is what you'll see me do now, like I've basically done a wash over top to get rid of most of the detail, and now I'm going to adjust the painting to really focus on which edges I think are important for the overall image. So I'm really going to soften things quite a lot. That doesn't mean that I don't want any sharp edges in there, but the only sharp edges I'll keep are the ones that are absolutely necessary for the description of the image itself. So the back of the neck I thought was quite important. top of the head obviously as well, and then some shapes on the side of the face also needed to be quite clearly visible. But there's a lot of openings there in that fence that's encapsulating my portrait, my statue, my bust, and that those openings are really what helps kind of turn this from a image into an art piece in my opinion. That transition is quite important because now we can actually think about how the eye would flow naturally through this scene. And if you think about what a painter does, is we try to simplify the world around us so that the viewers don't have to. We try to show them our view of the world. So if we want to simplify this because we think it's more appealing, then that's a perfectly valuable way to kind of go about that. So you can see in this image, for example, where all three are lined up, there's a very clear difference between the balanced one, the sharp-edged one, and the mostly soft one. So the balanced one is what most people would eventually accomplish, and there's nothing wrong with that one. I think this still looks perfectly fine. That's actually quite a nice painting. The sharp-edged one, ironically, sort of has more of that stylistic nature, and that's because the abstraction of those two-dimensional shapes are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So you can see how those 2D shapes are so important to get right when you are working on a painting like this. But the soft-edged one, I personally prefer that one over everything else because it just gives you such a simplistic view of a rather complicated subject. Because if you look at what's in the shadow, all of the details are sort of washed out, the eyes are practically hidden. It's just accurate shape design, choosing which pieces of information are absolutely crucial to the painting and which pieces of information that we can leave out for the most part. So if I would personally take a fairly organic approach to a painting, this is probably a good example of how I would do things. So I will think about the same things, but rather than blocking things out immediately in those sharp shapes, I'm thinking about already those sharp edges that I want to keep in. So the shapes that I'm designing immediately are the shapes that I think are essential to the readability of the object itself. So again, the top of the skull, the eye sockets, the cast shadow on the floor, the shapes in between those main features, in those anatomical features. And I'm sort of carving away the essential silhouette from that initial blob that I put down. Now, by the way, the reason for the underpainting is because I just kind of like to start with something vibrant so that hopefully that shines through in my final end result. But that's maybe a subject for another day on how to approach painting. But you can see how the approach I'm taking is sort of, rather than starting with a full-on like blocked out painting with those sharp edges, I'm continuously making these decisions based on the theory that I've been talking about today, right? So I'm continuously thinking about, okay, what can I leave out? Can I perhaps afford to soften an edge between sort of part of the eye sockets and the background? Is the back of the skull necessary to show, or can I actually make that mostly kind of disappear into the background? The edge between the teeth and the background itself, is that necessary? Or I do probably want to have those edges for that ambient occlusion between the top and the bottom teeth and in the inside of the nose and the eye sockets, for example. So I'm really trying to focus on where I want to have how much contrast to make sure that the painting itself stands out. And obviously I'm still adhering to the reference for the most part for that. Like, the reference is my guide to make sure that it is still appealing, but I can also make some artistic choices immediately. I don't have to go for a photocopy. I can decide to bring some values out more. I can decide to subdue some other values and turn it into something that is a piece of my own rather than, again, just a study of an object. So I hope that makes sense. Do keep in mind all of these things. It's a lot to take into account, but if you guys want to know more about painting and want to have some more Painting Fundamentals Fridays, it's definitely something we can do. But for now, check out the other videos on the channel. There's already quite a few in there, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.